the very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is alchemist, the whole state of things, a pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here.
Welcome to this week's edition of Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins. As always, sponsored by the People's Institute for Revolutionary Semiotics. Before we introduce our guest today, just want to mention we do have a Patreon at patreon.com/MUHH. Consider throwing us $1 a month there, or if not, maybe leave us a friendly little review on iTunes. On a more somber note, I just want to mention briefly that we just had a patron supporter that passed away suddenly, Austin Wiles, and I just wanted to take a moment on air. Austin was someone who was involved with, our friends at Acid Horizon, part of their reading groups, and we had corresponded as well via Patreon. So I just wanted to take a moment and celebrate Austin's life and wish him well on his journey. Not to be too maudlin there, but I just had to give him a shout out. Just found out about that this week. We're very excited to bring friend of the show, Grant Maxwell, on the happy hour today, and we're going to take a look at his new book, Integration and Difference, Constructing a Mythical Dialectic. So Grant, thanks so much for joining Taylor and I on the happy hour today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys. I'm very happy to be here with you today.
We usually start with our opening question about how one gets into philosophy. And I always love this personal story. I did want to ask you before you get into your, I don't know if you think about it as like catching a fever, because like sometimes I think about this when I think about how I got into philosophy. It's almost like you get bitten by like a bug or something, right? But I did want to ask you too about your two other books to mention, which I didn't get a chance to look at. One I know was on rock and roll and philosophy, and I thought that was really interesting and wanted to maybe just give you a second to talk about your two other works, and then you can kind of give us your anecdote, whatever it is, if you just have a memory or you just want to like anything you associate with what brought you into philosophy.
My path toward becoming a philosopher has been a bit circuitous. So I was doing a doctoral program at the City University of New York in Manhattan in English, actually. Yep. And so about 2.5 years into my coursework, when I was pretty much finishing up my coursework, I realized that I was taking every available theory class.
Yeah.
So I was taking classes on Foucault and Derrida and Haraway. I even took a couple classes with a great scholar of William James and Henry James.
Yeah, I see.
So we read James and Bergson. I realized that I was just enjoying reading those more than the literary texts.
Right.
Ultimately, what I realized is that the reason why I went into English is because my favorite professor in undergrad was this brilliant literary scholar at the University of Texas at Austin. His name is Adam Zachary Newton. And I think he's now the head of the English department at Yeshiva University in New York.
Okay.
And so I realized that I loved the modes of explication and interpretation characteristic of literary theory more than the literary texts themselves, although I do love literature. And so at that point, I seriously thought about switching to a philosophy department. And I looked at some of the philosophy departments around New York, and it seemed to me that it was all pretty much, exclusively analytic philosophy.
Yes.
And so I decided I love these French theorists, and I love, pragmatism, and I got really into Whitehead soon thereafter. Of course, the English philosopher. I decided that staying in an English department was the place to be, at least for my development in terms of my own thinking, if not necessarily, wasn't thinking as much about a career trajectory because I made that a little bit complex for myself.
Gotcha.
But just in terms of studying the philosophers that I wanted to study. So yeah, and then you mentioned my books. My first book which is called How Does It Feel? It's Elvis, the Beatles, Dylan, and the Philosophy of Rock and Roll. That was actually my dissertation.
Interesting. That's really cool.
Yeah, it's an early. It was developed from my dissertation, I would say. And then I wrote a short book that I think leans a little bit more toward popular philosophy, but I'm still very proud of it. And it's the dynamics of transformation. And that one came out in 2017. And then that was when I really started to get deeply into Deleuze after that book came out.
Gotcha.
And so, as we were talking about before we started recording, Deleuze is you can just go down so many rabbit holes with his work.
Yes.
And just there are an infinite number of paths to follow in terms of looking at the theorists that he was interested in. So that's sort of what I've been doing with myself for the last 6 years or so.
Yeah, I like your story because it actually sounds a lot like mine. When I remember taking a practical criticism class, which was the kind of the gateway to the higher English senior level classes. And that's when, I got a copy for the course, the Norton Anthology of Theory and Criticism. And I think that exposed me to so many theorists all at once, which was, it could have been a way to say like, no, that's not, that could easily like deter people. But I think that getting into Lacan, Derrida, it would be much later that I got into Deleuze, because just to cut my narrative short, I was just, resonating with you that's kind of how I got into it. And I do agree with you that English departments, comparative literature departments have a kind of broader freedom of approach, whereas philosophy departments are very, I don't want to say insular, but they're territorial, right? They have their niche and they kind of defend it. They have they occupy a certain ground, many of which is analytic philosophy. And in any case, with Deleuze, I think that what always surprised me getting into him more was how English departments, comparative literature departments, how little they actually gave him much leeway, besides maybe like some of the cinema books, because in some of the like film departments, the cinema books have a certain leeway. But Deleuze and Guattari, they write so much about literature that it's kind of surprising that he's left out. And I suppose it's because he doesn't create a method, if you want to call it that, like Derrida does, or something like this. Applying Deleuze to literature is perhaps not as straightforward.
Yeah,
right. Derrida has the hook of deconstruction. It's an ultimately complex, matrix, but it has a word to describe it. Whereas Deleuze, there's no real word to describe Deleuzian philosophy other than Deleuzian, or maybe transcendental empiricism, or perhaps constructivism.
Yeah, transcendental empiricism doesn't sound like it fits in a literature course, right? But again, like I do think that Deleuze and Guattari both have their own, in their solo works and together, they have unique approaches to literature, and so it is nice to see. As you pointed out, since 2000, I think in your chapter on Deleuze, your first footnote is like, since 2009, there's been this kind of burgeoning of interest in Deleuze. Obviously, he hasn't surpassed Foucault, but in some sense, I think that you pointed out he's surpassed Derrida, and it was just quantity of citations
on Google Scholar.
Yeah. So that's interesting to think about, but I would still be curious to know if there is a standard Deleuzian approach to literature with that, like Derrida got that treatment. I don't know if that's ever going to happen. You know what I mean? I think Deleuze is perhaps always going to be this liminal figure.
I think that's the way he wanted it. I think, so much of that's one thing about Derrida's work, is that it's remarkably consistent, even though it's incredibly difficult and obscure. He's always doing deconstruction. Whereas with, Deleuze, both with and without Guattari, he uses this complex system of concepts and terms, and then in the very next book, he'll discard most of them and create a whole new set of and I think once you read a lot of his work, you realize that he's getting at the same things in different ways with different language, and the different words open up different aspects of this intertwined system of concepts, but it's not really, he doesn't make it easy to access.
No, he doesn't.
You mentioned speculative empiricism. I thought that was maybe even a better way to characterize Deleuze. If you were going to, slap a label on him that you mentioned, I thought that was really good. I kind of resonated with that a little bit. But I wanted to just briefly mention too, like also another person coming from at the stuff through the lens or through the pathway of English during my undergrad. I double majored in sociology and English, and as part of the English degree, like everyone had to take this theory course. And I remember going to my professor's office hours and being like, I'm super interested in this. What should I read? And like the two books that she mentioned were 1,000 Plateaus and Simulacra and Simulation.
No shit, really?
Yeah.
That's not the first Deleuze book with a commentary that I would recommend.
Yeah, exactly. I remember trying to read it at the time, and I was like, "What the fuck?"
But it's a lot of fun, though, right? I mean,
of course, yeah.
That would be a lot of fun. Instead of she gave you like the Herculean task, but simulation and simulacra, you could get into
a lot more approachable. It was interesting. What really random coincidence too? Like this person had literally just replaced Todd McGowan at my school. The year before Todd McGowan was basically teaching this class. So that was like a wild, just missed connection or something.
I feel lucky in a way that I started reading Deleuze on the late side, because I had already read a lot of his biggest influences. I'd already read a lot of, he doesn't really talk that much about William James, but he praises him really highly. I had already, read a lot of Bergson. Whitehead, similarly, he praises him very highly, but actually, at one point in Difference and Repetition, and then also he writes that one chapter on him in The Fold, but Nietzsche. So it's like, I don't know if it would have been, I know a lot of younger sort of budding scholars are reading Deleuze before they're reading any other philosophy. And I think that, I guess it doesn't really matter how you get into philosophy as long as you get into it, because you'll read a lot of things eventually. But for me, I think that it would have been a lot more difficult to understand what the hell he was talking about if I hadn't, already read all of these other philosophers and spent a couple decades trying to understand Hegel and
right.
So it's a lifelong project, right?
Right, exactly.
Before Cooper and I started our series on Anti-Oedipus, we spent a few months diving into some Freud texts, and like the Rat Man, the Wolf Man,
Schreber case.
The Schreber case, which I think is a great way to start with at least the first chapter of Anti-Oedipus, is having some background of who the fuck Schreber was and why they're talking about a solar anus. And the narcissism text, a couple other texts too, like on negation and repression, on the vicissitudes of the drives. That I thought was good material to go over for us to, because I'm trying to get Cooper deeper into Deleuze. This is like my project is like, I've already Guattari-pilled him, so I'm trying to like progressively Deleuze pill him. And so, I think 1,000 Plateaus is obviously one of those texts that can never be mastered, if any text can, but it's one of those texts that's just really supposed to be enjoyed, as they say, like a record. You start with the plateaus that you kind of enjoy, and eventually you just sort of sprawl out as you will. But we've also, I know that one text he's always wanted to discuss is the text on The Fold, because Coop has his own interest in Leibniz and monads.
I'd love to talk about that.
Yeah, definitely. I put in the notes too. I really enjoyed the chapter on Leibniz and also Hegel quite a bit. Well, I was going to mention too, just to go back to the points about Deleuze and literature. I don't know if you've read Proust and Signs. What a remarkable work of literary criticism.
It's absolutely brilliant. He's doing philosophy in relation to Proust. And I think he's showing how Proust is philosophical. One thing that I love about that, there are a lot of things to love about that book. It's the search, right? That's sort of like the overriding theme of that work. But one small thing that I love about that work is that he affirmatively uses the word archetype in that book.
That's right. You point this out. That's something that I had, because Cooper and I, Cooper, was that the first Deleuze book that you like fully read?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I know that you were struck by it and its style, and obviously it was translated by Richard Howard, who just passed, I believe, this year, but he was in his 90s. And I reached out to him last year just to kind of, because I saw he was still alive. I was like, man, whether or not he responds, I at least want to reach out to someone who inspired me, as a translator. And he was very cordial and sent me a nice little note back. But, that was another thing I think that makes that text special, is not to disparage the other Deleuze translators, but having kind of it's the perfect translator for a book on Proust, someone who's translated in that milieu, other literary. I'm not sure if he's translated Proust before, but he translated kind of people in that vein, right? A literary translator. I'm just a poor, philosophical translator who's just trying to get by. He has some panache to it. But I did want to bring that up, that I had completely forgotten that he mentions archetypes in a positive way in Proust and Science until you had brought that up. And so, but he doesn't name Jung in that book, does he?
I don't think he does in that book. I mean, that's another thing that really struck me as I was reading Deleuze's books, is that he refers to Jung quite a bit, either by name in Difference and Repetition, or A Thousand Plateaus, or Anti-Oedipus. Sometimes critically, but probably more often in an affirmative, complimentary way. And then he refers to his concepts. I think I counted at one point, it was I think it's 9 or 10 texts where he's either referring to Jung by name, or to the archetypes, or he uses the word synchronicity in The Logic of Sense. And then there are some other things that are more ambiguous, like the word individuation, which I think he largely derived from Simondon. But he perhaps derived it from Jung.
That's possible.
Because we know that was into Jung as well. And then there's even the possibility that both the concepts of the rhizome and transversality, the transversal, were derived from Jung as well, which is it's pretty. We could talk about that evidence, but it's to me it's remarkable how many, and the self with a capital S. It's remarkable how many of Jung's concepts have permeated Deleuze's work, both with and without Guattari, and how little that's talked about by scholars of these philosophers.
This is really good because, well, first of all, I didn't even know about synchronicity being a Jungian concept. So you brought that to my attention, which is really great. But what is interesting too, you obviously quote the part he has where he finds Jung to have certain, I'm not even going to be able to paraphrase this well, but he sees Jung as having certain advances or advantages over Freud. But there's also that anecdote that he goes over in the Abecedere, which we recently watched for our talk with Charles Saval, but he mentions it in A Thousand Plateaus too, where Jung comes to Freud with this dream about an ossuary, right? About this whole monument of bones, and Freud wants to reduce it to a kind of a unity, to a bone, right? To
a single death wish,
a single thing, and it's and that for them, Deleuze I think says it even better in Abecedere, but in A Thousand Plateaus, they're using this as evidence about the one or several wolves that but Freud even knows this, that wolves come in a pack, and yet
that it's a multiplicity.
And yet he persists in his moves. I think Cooper and I talked about this a little bit with the Wolfman, for example, how he reduces the wolves in the primal scene of the Wolfman to the father, or to the father and the mother, right? Which is its own kind of, it's not the best multiplicity, right, for the pack, if you're reducing it to just the Oedipal scene. Exactly,
the Oedipal triangulation.
Yeah, right.
It's interesting that you bring up that figure of the wolf pack, because that's the central figure that Catherine Malibu discusses in her essay, Who's Afraid of Hegelian Wolves?
Right.
Which, of course, Catherine Malibu was a collaborator with Derrida, very well-regarded French philosopher. And she uses this figure that's actually derived from Jung to critique Deleuze's critique of Hegel. So it's just like, it's these footnotes within footnotes within footnotes.
Yeah.
That's hilarious that you mentioned that in that way, just because I'm a Dune addict and I've browbeaten Taylor to death with Dune references lately. If I may, I thought that kind of opened up what I found really kind of compelling in your discussion of Leibniz in particular, was the way that the little monads are sort of analogous to the same thing, like a multiplicity. It's like these little series of points. I forget the way you described it. I'd have to, let me see if I can find that actual.
What, divine machines?
Well, no. Okay. So it's here. You say, Leibniz, like Spinoza, came to associate with the immanent active power of the conatus, the inclinational striving for which each physical body is constituted in an aggregate of points, both containing and flowing from a metaphysical formal cause. But I thought that aggregate of points pointed towards like the similar thing, like a multiplicity sort of thing. And I really was connecting this to not only with that regard, but I thought this was really compelling in terms of, and I can't quite square the circle, if you will, but as it relates to like partial objects on the body without organs, or like zones of intensity on the body without organs, or even like these desiring machines or something like that. I don't know, just really conjures up a lot of very cosmic images that this is the kind of stuff that I love. So I don't know if you have anything to build, or either of you have anything to say on that note, but that's something that just kind of gripped my imagination. This is one aspect of why I'm super excited to delve into Leibniz a bit further.
So I think it's Simon Duffy in his book, Deleuze and the History of Mathematics. That's where I first saw it, that the monads are the metaphysical correlate of the infinitesimal of the calculus, which is, kind of central to Deleuze's metaphysics, especially in difference and repetition. So, and that's sort of like a thread that runs throughout the book. And, I'm not a mathematician, so I'm not an expert in the calculus. It's more like the history of the development of that mathematical instrument, and specifically the difference between the Newtonian version of the calculus and the Leibnizian version of the calculus. I find that fascinating. And I think you're right, Cooper, that it sort of permeates Deleuze's work in these late 60s texts, and then also it goes into his work with Guattari in terms of, I was just thinking earlier about how at various points they equate, so difference is obviously at least partially derived from the differential calculus. And at one point they equate difference with the body without organs, which they equate with the Tao. These are from all different texts from different decades, and with Spinoza and immanence. And so it's like, they're getting at, from all these different angles, they're trying to get at something that always recedes as you approach it, which is describable as the infinitesimal, that you can never attain that thing itself. It's an always receding horizon of indiscernibility.
That's
it's like Gödel's theorem too, was what this reminded me too of, because you can kind of like keep having that distance perpetually. Reminded me of the way that you were talking about the segments of the curve of the line, right? There's like the infinite segments, like it approaches, it's between 0 and 1, or I can't remember the specifics. If you guys feel free to correct me there.
More than 0, less than any real number.
Any positive. Yeah. It's this paradoxical quantity that, it's Simon Duffy also has this really great concept of, well, it's not his concept, but I learned about it from him. It's of the syncagorematic. It's for any problem, any particular question, the solution is always adequate to answering that question. So it's only infinitesimal, and we're talking about summing together an infinite series to construct a line or a curve in the calculus. But so it's on one plane of description that this is the syncagorematic quality of the infinitesimal version of the calculus. But on one plane of description, it's always a finite quantity that's just small enough to give you an exact answer for whatever scale that you need. But in its abstract ontological definition, it's always receding towards the infinitely small. So in that way, it kind of integrates continuity and discontinuity, because you have the finite answer, but also the infinitesimally receding singularity.
Yeah, I like this use of the syncagorematic, because what it really highlights is the fact that outside of the differential relation in which it is part of the solution, it doesn't necessarily have meaning, right? It's kind of how Deleuze himself talks about he talks about reciprocal determination in terms of the differential equation. Outside of the relation between dy and dx, those values don't really mean anything. But in that relation, there is this form of determination that he's trying to seek as part of his whole elaboration, right, of whether it be difference or whether it be the virtual, et cetera, right? The realm of the ideas, if you will. So I did like all of this, and it feels like, just thinking about your subtitle, you would need a chapter on Leibniz in order to give more concreteness to this question of difference and integration, which I wanted to ask more about that specifically. I know we are jumping around a little bit, but this is fun. Was that subtitle meant as, or not subtitle, that's the main title. Was that meant to echo Deleuze's difference and repetition, or was that just a coincidence?
No, it was absolutely meant to echo difference and repetition. So the initial title that I had was integration, because the seed for the book was that I wanted to look at this concept of integration in all of these theorists who explicitly talk about it, from William James Bergson, Whitehead, Jung, Deleuze, James Hillman, who's my favorite Jungian, who's now passed, and Isabel Sangers, who's probably my favorite living philosopher. And they all discuss this concept of integration. And as I got deeper into these texts, I was like, well, you can't really talk about integration without differentiation. And even in difference and repetition, Deleuze has these words of, one is differentiation with a T, and one is differentiation with a C. Yes. And at one point, or I think a couple of times, he says that differentiation is synonymous with integration, and it's actualization. It's
right.
It's in dramatization.
Yeah.
It's in the drama differentiation.
Yeah, right. It's less of a spoken word. It's more of something that can only be seen. We brought this up with John Rofe last week, or not last week, 2 weeks ago. But because I was
episode's out now.
I was trying to point out how differentiation with the TC was kind of Deleuze's différance, right? That you can't really hear it. You have to, it can only be written. It's the difference that can't be spoken, if you will, right?
I was like, why is he using this other slightly different version of differentiation which is differentiation, which he's rendering synonymous with integration? And the conclusion that I came to is that through that word, he wanted to really emphasize always intimate intertwining of integration and differentiation, that they can't be separated, and that actually the process of differentiation is integral to the process of integration.
Yeah, and I think that it's nice that it helps to shed light on, with differentiation with the C, he's thinking of, for example, one of the main examples is like the biological, but he's thinking, as you said, of actualization, whereas with differentiation with the T, it's more on the side of ideas, events, of this more kind of purely mathematical, problematic side. And to have two words for both, what's nice is, and you kind of mentioned this in passing, and I say in passing, but you do mention this is why Deleuze doesn't feel that integration and differentiation are opposites. Like Newton might think they're just reversible sides, but for Deleuze, that doesn't really make sense to think that actualization would just be a kind of opposite of, whether he would call it, I'm trying to think of the word. I don't think it's perplication, but he has different words, right? Because there's explication, which would be kind of more on the side of qualities and actualization, but then there's complication, perplication. We won't get into all that,
right? Yeah.
Which he kind of quickly abandons. But for the most part, but he does say, like, explicitly in the text that that integration and differentiation can't be thought of as just reversible sides or opposites. That they each play a kind of asymmetrical yet obviously intimately related sides of the process.
Right. Going back to what you were saying about it's similar to Derrida and Deleuze, bringing in. I know you guys interviewed Vern Sisney. I think his book Deleuze and Derrida is wonderful, and it's been really influential on my thinking about the relation between those two theorists.
Yes.
Not to skip over his entire book and get to the conclusion, but the conclusion that he comes to is that they both propound a differential ontology. As you were saying, is this idea that there's no ultimate transcendent fixed objective grounding that's, whether the Platonic forms or the an ultimate ground of materiality that the world is sort of a degeneration of, or is derived from. Rather, it's this univocity and pure immanence, which is that there's no outside there's no outside of the world, and that our consciousness and the world we experience is a limited construction from a more expansive, univocal, immanent manifold, and that our project is to expand. Anyway, so I'm going off in a different direction.
No. This is good.
Keep going.
I would say that you summarize this well in your chapter on Derrida, your opening chapter after the introduction, which is to, as you point out, Derrida is kind of more on the side of Hegel. You already kind of intimated that with Malibu's pushback against Deleuze. And insofar as he's more on the side of Hegel, he privileges, I don't even know if that's the right word, but he tarries with the negative, right?
He tarries, yeah. There's an end note in Writing Indifference that actually I came to my attention first through Verne's book, where he says that deconstruction enacts a negativity so negative that it can't be considered negative any longer. Yes. It's a negativity beyond the negative. So basically what Verne says is that that Derrida propounds a negative differential ontology and Deleuze propounds a positive differential ontology. That's not just affectively negative and positive, but it is affectively negative and positive. I mean, Derrida, the affects that he dwells with are terror, shame, mourning, loss. And we love him for that because he cleared the space in which a novel positive mode could emerge. And so these terms, I don't remember if Verne specifically talks about Schelling, but these words, as you guys probably know, are from Schelling's late lecture on the grounding of positive philosophy, where it's the negative is the rational, analytic mode of thought that tends to reduce entities of whatever kind down into their constituent elements in order to understand them. So, he thinks that Aristotle was primarily negative, whereas Plato was, and then, and that Kant was the peak of the negative philosophy. And then, of course, Schelling himself was according to Schelling, was the emergence of a novel positive philosophy. But, and positive philosophy is, it posits novel metaphysical entities, which brings us around to so there are those two Berlin lectures that he gave in his 60s in the 1840s after he took over Hegel's old professorship after Hegel died in Berlin. And the one is the grounding of positive philosophy, and the other one is the introduction to the philosophy of mythology, where he correlates. He uses this word potency, and he correlates these potencies, which are I think this is what Deleuze says in Difference and Repetition, that Schelling's greatest contribution is the theory of powers, which of course is the same word as potency. They come from Latin, and it's potens, power, potential, in potentia, and powers. It's the god. So he's discussing the gods of Hellenic polytheism in this late lecture, and so I think that's really interesting because another thing, I feel like I'm lecturing now, so
no.
Feel free to jump in.
I will jump in, but you keep going.
But another thing that isn't mentioned very often about Deleuze is that he talks about the gods of Hellenic polytheism quite a bit in many texts from various decades, from What is Grounding and empiricism and subjectivity. Wait, no, not in empiricism. Anyway, no, What is Grounding for sure. That's
he does do it
around mythology.
And some of the collected essays, which are from different decades, we see. I think in Desert Islands there was a text that you cited that I took a look at yesterday, or it could be Two Regimes of Madness. I always mix them up because they're just kind of very. I want to get to Schelling in a second. You did anticipate my question, which is obviously right in front of you. When I first read that because this appears in the introduction. And I was thinking, I almost did like a Derridian move when you were writing about Derrida, where I thought I'd caught like this parapraxis, a slippage where you say, and I have the quotes here, Hegel is affectively beyond Derrida. Derrida is affectively prohibited from entering this promised novel domain, which you say he helps to clear away the space for, which is the sort of negative movement beyond negativity, right? That he helps to clear this space for, as you said, for this positing or this positive side. And then when I got into the Derrida chapter, I noticed that, in fact, you did mean affectively instead of effectively. And so I guess that was my question. You kind of answered a little bit, but how much, in your view, if Derrida is the one example that I brought up, but for all of these thinkers, how much did the affective side of their thinking influence your discussions of them in relation, just distinct from the sort of more purely theoretical, if we can make that break? Because I do think that it's a purely abstract move to do, but there is something to that I was a little bit sensitive to. It's just the way in which you yourself were sensitive to this affective dimension of the thinkers under consideration.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's this tendency in philosophy to want to think in this purely disembodied sort of conceptual, rational way.
Right.
And I think from Spinoza to Nietzsche to Bergson to James and Whitehead, I think these are all, and then of course Deleuze, these are all theorists who are, and Derrida, of course, are bringing affect, the felt reality of bodily experience, intimately back into the practice of philosophy. Because this is one of the primary concerns of my book is that philosophers, I think generally, are motivated to spend decades of their lives pursuing these, profound and paradoxical, problematic questions, for not just out of sort of disembodied curiosity or something like that. They're impelled to pursue these problematic questions because they're affective problems for them. And so I talk about this in relation to Nietzsche, I think, is probably the most direct and clearest example that he discussed ressentiment, and he just so clearly experienced that himself. Like, for instance, in that the untimely meditation on David Strauss, which is I think it's the first thing he published after The Birth of Tragedy. And it's just this fugue of hate reading against Strauss's book. And it's like, you only have to sort of just dig a little bit beneath the surface. And I mean, that's one interesting thing, is that there's this prohibition against what they call psychologizing in analytic philosophy.
Right.
And I think that's absurd. And somebody who's, really pushed against that is, you guys probably know him as David Hoyinski. He does work on bringing biography back into the picture. And I think that you can't really understand what someone is doing philosophically without knowing, and I think this is more true in some cases than others, but without understanding what's going on with their biography. And I mean, Nietzsche, I think, is probably the most biographical of philosophers. So he spends this whole book, or this whole untimely meditation, railing against David Strauss, who, it just so happens, his book came out the same year as Nietzsche's, and was a very popular book.
Yes, was very popular.
Yeah,
right. Was timely. It was timely.
Yeah, it was timely. Sense. Exactly. And whereas Nietzsche's was sort of widely panned by philologists and academics and didn't sell very well, and kind of ruined his academic reputation and made him basically, before the book came out, hundreds of students were coming to his public lectures. And then after the book came out, his classes were being canceled because
he wasn't doing philology in that practice academic sense, right?
Exactly. But he spends this whole work just railing against Strauss, Strauss's book basically critiques the miraculous in Christianity while still affirming a sort of humanist Christian ethics. Nietzsche even, I think, said later that he was a little jealous of Strauss for having, had the courage to critique Christianity, which Nietzsche, of course, would become the preeminent critic of Christianity later, but he didn't do it in The Birth of Tragedy. So, I think Nietzsche was able to see so deeply into ressentiment because he experienced that affect so completely himself. Derrida, he talks about his biography as a French Jewish person growing up in Algeria, which is predominantly Arab country. This is and right when he was growing up, there were all these political upheavals, and his parents, they lost their home and their citizenship or something along those lines, and he moved to Paris. And so it's, his work is permeated by this sense of loss and mourning and closure.
Right. And
he says at one point, I got this from Peter Salmon's wonderful biography of Derrida, An Event Perhaps. He says at one point, does my biography explain everything? No, of course not. But could I explain anything without it? No, definitely not. So it's like, and so this becomes a central aspect of my sort of loving critique of Deleuze's critique of Hegel, which we
Right.
could talk about if we wanted to go into that.
Oh, yes, of course. I think this is a good way to set up. Before we do, maybe we could say a word about the Schelling passage that you just mentioned from Difference of Repetition, because that's where he, and I'm not sure if he's drawing from Schelling or not, but he says this is where he describes anger and love as powers of the idea. And anger is like part of the process of selection, right, with the eternal return. Right. So I just thought that was interesting too, that even within that little, almost like an aside, right, because he has this aside, he's like, it almost feels like this footnote that he's inserted into the text, because there are moments in Difference of Repetition that feel like that, like with his notes on being and time. It feels like a supervisor was like, hey, you might want to say something about Heidegger. But he has this aside. He even puts it in parentheses about how unfair Hegel's black night in which all cows are black, right? Deleuze almost like feels effectively for Schelling.
He I interrupted you to not remember the word. I was trying to.
He has a sympathy for him. Yeah, he identifies with him, and this is where he's kind of saying Schelling's, which you kind of already mentioned this, but we can see this elsewhere in the text where Deleuze is going into this notion of a grounding, ungrounding, which is definitely has a Schellingian type of a flavor to it. But this notion of anger and love as powers of the idea, I think it makes it kind of brings back to the fore that even for Deleuze, there are these sort of terrible affects that aren't excluded, right, from something that might seem, because for him, ideas are not just in our head, right? They are, and the best way he describes this is when he goes into the idea of society and the economic and Althusser's reading of Marx. Anyway, I guess that to lead into Deleuze and Hegel, I was interested in the way in which, and you've already kind of anticipated this a little bit, but the way in which Schelling for you helps to give us an indication of where Deleuze is going to go, and helps to kind of perhaps pave a path for one of the preliminary pushbacks against Hegel. So I guess that would be my question for you, is the figure of Schelling, specifically with, I guess, the mythical part, because that's a part of your subtitle, right? This notion of a mythical dialectic. So perhaps you could say a few words about this side of it. You've already, again, sort of anticipated this, but maybe say a little bit more about this mythical dialectic and what it means for you.
So that phrase is taken from a passage in Difference and Repetition. He doesn't use that exact phrase of mythical dialectic. It's the section where he's talking about Plato, and I think it's the repetitious circulation of souls in the Republic.
Yes.
And basically what he's saying is that he's sort of defending Plato against Aristotle's critique of Plato, that he merely sort of goes back to a mythical mode of thought. What's the word I'm looking for? Reverts to a mythical mode of thought.
Like in the Phaedrus, for example.
Right, in the Phaedrus, yeah.
Or in the Republic, right? The use of allegory and myth in order to explain what is not rational. Anyway, go ahead.
Right, yeah. So he's talking about how it's the dialectical method of division, which is just essentially, as you know, it's just, okay, so we have this one entity. Now let's divide it up into two entities. This Socrates is just going on and on. I don't remember which dialogue this is in, but it's just, now let's divide one of those up into another one. And it's just this constant division into
the sophist, right? That's I think that
is that the sophist? Yeah,
I think that's one of the texts that he kind of does this, but yeah. Go ahead.
I'd have to look back. They all kind of blend together for me.
Yeah, exactly.
But so then Deleuze says that it's this unexpected thing that Plato does, where he it's the unexpected introduction of myth into the dialectic, and it integrates myth into the dialectic.
Interesting. Okay, gotcha.
And so it's, I think a lot of people, when they think of Deleuze, they think, oh, Deleuze is rejecting dialectic altogether. And I don't think that's the case, because, I think people often tend to conflate dialectic in general with the Hegelian dialectic. And of course, he is rejecting the Hegelian dialectic.
Yes.
But what he's saying is he's advocating a deeper dialectic that's a dialectic of existence. And, you mentioned Schelling's theory of powers, and I'm not sure if it's in that section that you were talking about or if it's somewhere else in the text, but he specifically refers to the God of love and the God of anger. And he's talking about series of polytheistic potencies.
Yes.
And this is, I'm pretty sure he doesn't explicitly refer to Schelling's series of lectures on the philosophy of mythology, but I'm pretty sure that must be what he's referring to, because this is exactly what Schelling talks about in, historical critical introduction to the philosophy of mythology, which is a bit of a mouthful. But it's, he's talking about this series of gods from Uranus to Kronos to Zeus. And, another thing that he talks about is how one of the main things he does in that series of lectures is he goes through and he looks at all of the explanations for mythology that have been propounded for the last several millennia and sort of crosses them all off the list. And he says, okay, they're just poetic inventions, the gods and heroes of mythology. They are just explanations for natural phenomena. They are real humans who were elevated to a divine status.
Right.
And he goes through a bunch of things like this. And the conclusion that he ultimately comes to is that there's truth in all of those explanations, but the truth of the gods of polytheism is that their ontological status is ambiguous, that they're not these divine beings that reside in some fixed transcendent domain, but they're also not just products of human invention, that they are constitutive of consciousness. And
okay, interesting.
And they're actually, the gods are correlated with, Spinoza correlates the affects and the formal causes. And so this is it's sort of a deeper register of formal causation, than the Platonic transcendent forms, which have a greater reality and everything is just a attenuated degeneration of those forms. They're transcendental, virtual, formal potentialities that infinitely recede as they're approached, like the infinitesimal of the calculus, like monads. They're dynamisms, which is another word that what Deleuze, which of course is just the translation of potency. It's dynamis in Greek and potens in Latin. So, and then of course that brings us to the eternal return and will to power. Yeah, and I didn't really understand the will to power, and who knows who understands the will to power, but I think the thing that really opened up the will to power for me is that Deleuze says it's not a will to, the lowest expression of the will to power is the will to dominate others. Yes. And that's the error that the Nazis made. They took just the most facile, the most reductive interpretation of Nietzsche and ran with it. But what I think he really means is the will to powers, the will to potencies.
To the nth power, right?
Yeah, to the nth power. But it's taking all of these affectively correlated potencies, which in Spinoza, the affects are the will. The affects constitute the will. I think that's why Spinoza says he rejects the idea of free will, which I don't think means he rejects the idea of choice. I think he's just saying that we can't control the affective complexes that are always coursing through us and that are always motivating our conceptual creations as thinkers. But what we can do is we can choose at which register to express these affective potencies that constitute our will. So I use the example of Deleuze, because in Francois Dassé's biography, he talks a lot about Deleuze's childhood, and it's pretty clear that he had an Oedipal relationship with his father, who was an anti-Semite and are sort of very conservative, and which is diametrically opposed to Deleuze's very extremely progressive political views. And also his parents, he had an older brother. You guys, I'm probably telling you guys.
No.
You already know, but
but this is good for the listener. You can add this too.
During World War II, during the Nazi occupation in Paris, Gilles and his brother Georges were sent off to school to get away from the Nazis. These two, they were very close. I think that it was kind of like a boarding school sort of situation, and they were very close. And then his brother graduated and went off to fight the Nazis and was killed, heroically fighting the Nazis.
He becomes a hero, right?
Right, he becomes a hero. And so, based on quotes from various friends of Deleuze's, it sounds like Deleuze's parents sort of always resented him for not being the one who died, because he was sort of like the mediocre son, while Georges was the hero. I mean, can you imagine thinking, in my opinion, possibly the most brilliant philosopher of all time,
well,
is the mediocre child?
I mean, even as late as the Abecedere, which wasn't supposed to air until after his death, even if a little bit of it did air during his lifetime or at the end of his life. But even at that point, he doesn't mention his brother very much, but he does mention being a mediocre student until later on. And he does mention his father, right, as being, I mean, pretty blatantly, he's just like being an anti-Semite, as you pointed out. And so, yeah, there is that Oedipal conflict, the sibling rivalry, and
he also compliments his father. He says his father was, very benevolent, very good. So he seems kind of ambivalent in his relation to his father.
Yeah.
And obviously, I think his brother's death was also traumatizing for him. And Dassey says that was quickly repressed.
This is part of the double-edged sword of the biography that I think, and you even kind of bring out some of this tension where Doss does have a tendency sometimes to psychologize a little much, even if, as you say, and as Derrida says, the biography should be dealt with. One of the more blatant examples, and Janosko kind of really takes Doss down for this, which is where he kind of recounts Guattari's formative moment. He's like 9 years old playing at the foot of his grandfather, who, has a heart attack and passes away immediately, and how this was like this formative event that we can see back to, some Oedipal stuff. And I think that Janosko is merely saying more that it's not necessarily something that shouldn't be discussed. It's the emphasis with which Doss seems to downplay, the next 25 years of learning and study that Guattari has under. Right. I mean, because you could do the same thing with Guattari's relationship to Lacan and do a whole Oedipal thing too there. But I think all of this is definitely important. And there was one point I wanted to make. Oh, sorry. If you want to jump back in, that's fine.
Let me just in relation to that. So I think it's like you don't want to be biographically reductive.
Yes,
but which is something that Salmon talks about in relation to Derrida. One of my primary arguments in relation to a lot of these philosophers is that these affective complexes, their philosophy can't be reduced to these affective complexes, but rather, or to these biographical events that caused these biographical complexes.
Right.
So this goes back to Freud. I mean, Freud eventually moved away from the idea that these psychological complexes were caused by literal traumatic events, and he moved toward a more ambiguous mode that I think was taken up really profoundly by Jung, that these are ultimately archetypal complexes, or they're complexes of affective potencies. And I'm talking about sort of Jung's latest conception of the archetypes, not his earlier conception where they were more psychological or merely psychological. But I think there's a lot of resonance with Schelling's discussion of the ambiguous ontological status of the gods. That it's not that the biography is the ultimate cause of these affective complexes, which are then expressed through philosophy. It's that there's a dark or obscure precursor that's a singularity. Deleuze and Guattari, I think, talk about this in relation to Nietzsche. They mention how the events of, was it Nietzsche or Kafka? Maybe it was Kafka. Anyway, the events of a philosopher's, or it must have been Nietzsche. Anyway, the events of a philosopher's life fit the tone of their philosophy, but it's not that necessarily that the events cause the philosophy. It's that they all resonate in a non-local, non-linear series, leading back infinitesimally toward an obscure precursor.
Right.
And I think in my opinion, Deleuze was more influenced by Jung than he let on.
Yeah.
Because, understandably, there was a bit of a backlash against Jung because of his interest in occult phenomena, which, was sort of precluded, especially, in the 20th century, precluded one from being taken seriously as an academic. Though I think that's changing. I mean, I think if you look at, Spinoza was interested in, James, Bergson, even Deleuze, they were all interested in various occult phenomena.
Even Freud's later writings, right? He has the little essay on on telepathy. Even he delves into the to the unconscious a little bit. And I thought it was interesting that you brought to light how when Deleuze is skeptical of the archetypes, he's probably thinking of the more mainstream version, which is Jung's earlier version of the archetypes, which, as you said, might be more static, might be more psychological. But I think that perhaps you could say a word about this later version, because it does remind me a little bit about how, as I said, ideas are not merely psychological or in the head. They have forms of actualization. They have a relationship with that, and so they're also, they're, what does he call them? Complexes of coexistence, and not merely just ideas that, they don't just occupy a space in the brain or something reductive like that. So perhaps that's kind of how I was thinking a little bit deeper about Jung's latest version of the archetype and rethinking their complex of coexistence, if you will. Do you want to say a word about that later version that you draw on in your chapter on Jung?
Mysterium Conjunctionis is his last full-length monograph, which I think was published in 56, maybe 1956, when he was in his 80s. And in that book, Jung is an extremely prolific and extremely generative pioneer. And he went through a period after his expulsion from psychoanalysis in the teens, after his break with Freud, where he underwent basically a schizoanalysis. He says that he did a schizophrenia. So he sort of semi-intentionally schizophrenized, and that resulted in the Red Book. Jung, ultimately, he always asserted that he was a physician and not a philosopher, though I think he became increasingly philosophical over the course of his work. The primary philosopher that he would refer to, I think he would always sort of go back to Kant, because that's who he read when he was young. So he's inconsistent, is what I'm saying. But so were Deleuze and Guattari. I mean, they even said it explicitly that they're not after consistency or coherence. They're after the creation of concepts and the opening to novel domains and things like that. So Jung was exploring new paths. And so I think in Mysterium Conjunctionis, it's all about alchemy, and he specifically looks at 4 alchemical texts from late medieval, early modern period. He shows how these texts are the precursor of depth psychology. And the way he talks about the archetypes in that book, especially, he uses the word transcendental, and he uses it in the correct way, as opposed to transcendent, which is, from Kant, which is, this idea that the transcendent is this, fixed, static domain above or beyond the world. Whereas the transcendental is the recognition that there's this always receding horizon of discernibility, and beyond that horizon of discernibility is a virtual potential domain but it's still an immanent domain. There's nothing outside of the world, because the world is infinite. You can't go outside of something that's infinite. So the world is all that is the case. And I think this is Richard Tarnas. He's a Jungian scholar that has been influential in my thinking about this. And also James Hillman, I think, is the one who has most brilliantly developed Jung's thinking. He's an American psychologist who was actually, I think, born the same year as Deleuze. And the chapter on Hillman, which is the one that comes right after Deleuze, it basically shows how many resonances there are between this great Jungian psychologist, who's, as far as Jungian thinkers go, he's the most difficult and obscure and philosophical end of that spectrum. So he's great. I love Hillman. But so basically, I think Jung's late conception of the archetypes are really resonant with. I mean, Deleuze talks about formal causes in so many different terms, quasi causes and simulacra and phantasms and ideas, problems, questions, multiplicities. All of these, I think, are different inflections of a more subtle kind of. It's a formal causation. He says this somewhere, that it's an inflection of formal causation that recedes, or that goes so far that it exceeds the duality of form and formlessness.
Right.
So it kind of exceeds this Aristotelian notion of formal cause and its rejection, because it sort of dwells in the interstices between that and deconstructs that opposition to find what's this ambiguous reality that can't be localized either within human consciousness or in some objective transcendent domain, that it's in this, it's the relationality of the world, that it's extracted from that relationality, constructed from that relationality.
I like that way of putting it, and it kind of gets back to this other link with Deleuze and Jung, which is Simondon, and it kind of helps to articulate why Simondon was so interested in individuation, and why he took it seriously, that you can't start from form and matter in this abstract way in the hylomorphic schema. You can't start with the constituted individual and sort of work back. You've already kind of you've already spoiled the ground, right? You've already begged the question, if you will. And what I like about this is that we are starting to get to the heart of the matter that we wanted to discuss today, which was the relationship between Deleuze and Hegel. And Coop, I'm going to put you on the spot, if you don't mind. You mentioned enjoying the Hegel chapter as well as the Leibniz chapter. And I just wanted to know what stood out for you in terms of the rendering of Hegel in Grant's book.
Oh, man. I guess it was just setting up a very nice little dialectic, if you will, between this sort of oppositional framework that I guess the sort of binary opposition thing that Derrida gets into a bit. But I thought you had a really good example of how, I think, to me, this really pushed a good understanding of how dialectics actually sort of work, at least in a sort of abstract way, in relation to gender or sexual difference.
Yeah.
Let me see if I can find this. I know I have it in my notes because Taylor commented on it.
I replied. This is.
I'll just go ahead and read this. The dialectic can be discerned in the consummation of sexual reproduction, in which the opposite sexes are drawn to one another in relations that are by turns harmonious and discordant to produce a third entity, the child, that embodies a seamless integration of the two parents, and which itself is capable of eventually producing a further emergence from opposition by producing a child through such consummation. And like a newborn child, a bare philosophical principle is only an incitement to activity, is only a potentiality until it goes back through decades, generations, or even centuries of expression in relation to concrete experience, receives critiques and refutations that provoke its refinement and expansion until the ultimate conception is developed into a mature, nuanced system. I mean, we could sort of really delve into, I think, the sexual difference stuff, but I think this is really good. This goes back to I think the image of the bud and the flower and so forth was
right.
Also another great way to sort of, I guess, draw this way that, I guess, I don't know how you would describe it. I guess the sort of movement of history, and, we could get into the sort of Leibnizian sort of folding and so forth, and how that generates difference and all of that from here. But I just thought that was sort of great, how you can only sort of retroactively recognize these sort of distributed potentialities through the fabric of reality that sort of then crystallize in these moments. And then it becomes obvious. And, this is sort of maybe even lead us to the way that they talk about the development of the state. It comes all at once in Anti-Oedipus, for example. I don't know. I feel like I'm just rambling a bit there, and maybe one of you could rein me in a bit.
No, and I wasn't even when I commented, I wasn't pushing back. I was, I guess, talking about how there is a way of. This is a great analogy for the dialectic, and it does though show how these binaries are also constructed, right? And they're not necessarily naturally given. So that was part of my differentiation and integration going on, was sort of taking the analogy, but also giving the Derridian.
And that would be a good way to sort of work through the difference between, I guess, a certain dialectic and the sort of multiplicity as it relates to sex. Like if we bring in Lacan, it's there's a differential relationship between the genders and the phallus, for example, right? There's no sort of transversal or relationship directly between male and female or what have you on the different sides of sort of how sexuation works. It's more of I don't know how you would describe it, Taylor. There'd be there's no woman, there's a becoming woman, if that makes sense at all.
No, but I think this is a good way to set up how Hegel works through. It's a good analogy. It's a concrete analogy, more concrete than being in nothingness, for example, right?
Yeah.
That's kind of difficult, just off the cuff to conceptualize with how Hegel usually starts the dialectic with being and nothingness. And this is, I think, one of the ways that Deleuze, points back or pushes back against the dialectic is how does one start with a category like being rather than something, right? It's just one of the ways. But we can get into all the different calling into question of Hegel that Deleuze formulates, and perhaps why he sees Hegel's dialectic as, I don't know if trying to think of the way he says it, but it's either a perversion or like a confusion. Calling it a perversion of like the Platonic dialectic or something is almost an honor to Hegel. He says something like Hegel was the last thinker to like take the question, what is X, seriously, right? It's this way in which Hegel takes what he calls a propedeutic method, like this method of instruction in the Platonic dialogues that usually lead to aporia, and takes that as the method itself. And that this way of reducing the dialectic, I think for Deleuze is privileging non-being in a way that he wants to privilege non-being in a different way, right? The non is the problematic rather than the negative. And I guess that would be my way of anticipating some of this dialogue, and instead of just fully fleshing it out. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I want to know perhaps your interest in this opposition, because you do spend a good deal of time working through it in your Deleuze chapter, and you've already mentioned Malibu and her critique, which is a good one, but this is obviously a big topic. You also mentioned Henry Summers Hall, which I thought was interesting, right? That he sees ultimately there are resonances, but that Hegel and Deleuze are not, their philosophies aren't compatible.
They're ultimately incompatible. Yeah.
You kind of push back against that. That would be my question, is in this unfolding in your book of differentiation and integration, this is one of those climactic scenes, if you will, the struggle between the two. Uh-huh. Maybe just talk a little bit about how these figures are working for you in your work.
So first of all, I love both Hegel and Deleuze. Hegel, I loved more earlier in my philosophical explorations, and reading Deleuze really showed me his limitations. And so I ultimately agree with Deleuze's critique of the Hegelian dialectic. But I also think that he goes too far in his rejection of the negative. But I think that Deleuze and Guattari, they explicitly relate the dialectic to the Oedipal triangulation. Deleuze in the preface, the American preface to Difference and Repetition, even says that there's something like a Titanic father complex in relation to Hegel in France in the 60s. So I think, but as with these other affective complexes that we were discussing earlier, I think that it's this complex in relation to Hegel, which actually Vern Sisney is the first person who suggested this to me, that Deleuze's reading of Hegel is really filtered through Hippolyte's reading of Hegel. And so, Deleuze had it was sort of like a substitution for Deleuze's relation with his father, because Hippolyte was, of course, the French translator of the Phenomenology of Spirit. He was the eminent Hegelian in the 60s in France, probably, and 50s too. And Deleuze dedicated his first book, Empiricism and Subjectivity, in 1953 to Hippolyte. So they were very close student-teacher relationship, which is, somewhat similar to the father-son son relationship. And then in the 60s, so Hippolyte was Deleuze's dissertation advisor for what would become Difference and Repetition. But he really didn't like that Deleuze was critiquing Hegel. And I think, he was also critiquing Hippolyte via Hegel. And I think this is just a classic archetypal situation. You have Freud and Jung, you have Lacan and Guattari. It's just this classic situation, even like Whitehead and Bertrand Russell, where they're working really close together for a number of years, this older and younger thinker, and then they have this break over this central concern. And so Hippolyte started, I think, spreading these supposedly slanderous rumors about Deleuze's sexuality, which, of course, I think to his credit, Deleuze didn't care about the content of the rumors, because he's, I love that one.
The anecdote.
The one anecdote where someone someone calls him a slur against being homosexual, basically, and he says yes, and so
Yeah.
and it's just
So
like
what?
who cares? And I think that's one of Deleuze's projects. I mean, he was in favor of a thousand sexes, and he was really problematized this binary gender or binary sexuality.
Yeah,
And,
in,
of course,
in sexes, right? The in comes
right,
back,
yeah.
right? Yeah.
And so, he was married to a woman, but and there's a lot of speculation about whether, he and Guattari might have had some kind of sexual relationship.
It doesn't really matter.
Who really cares?
Yeah.
It's fine.
You're right. Just to jump in for a second, that I revisited this because I had forgotten this. The way that Doss brings it up is that Hippolyte's wife was like this prude and didn't really like him hanging around with Deleuze, probably his star student. And it seems like Doss is mentioning that she's the one who wanted him to sort of have this break, but that doesn't necessarily that doesn't necessarily justify or explain why then Hippolyte was talking shit and spreading rumors about Deleuze. It's kind of an underhanded way to break the relationship,
Totally. I mean, maybe she was just tired of him complaining about Deleuze all the time or something.
I could.
But it's like it's very similar to the Freud-Jung break, because Jung was kept critiquing Freud and specifically critiquing the Oedipal complex, that was the only concession to a mythological mode of thought. And
Interesting.
And Jung was sort of like, well, but there are all these other mythical motifs that are also equally expressed and have nothing to do with the Oedipal dialectic. And so there's all of that, but very far from discounting Deleuze and Guattari's critique of the Oedipal. I think that it shows how his biography and his relation to these important figures in his life resonate with the work that he did. And it's sort of like it's an affective, I would call it an archetypal complex, that can be expressed at a lower, higher register. So one can express the Oedipal complex as merely an Oedipal drama where one is mad at one's father and perhaps has some perverse, sexual feelings towards one's mother or something like that. But in this case, that's the thing, we don't really know much about Deleuze's relationship with his mother. But it's so one can express it in that register, or one can express it on the highest order as epic making philosopher, going so deeply into this Oedipal complex that that's the thing. It's Deleuze in an interview talks about how he and Guattari sort of viewed this Oedipal. They refer to it as kind of like an Oedipal accelerationism in Kafka. It's the acceleration of the Oedipal. And so Guattari was more in favor of this Oedipal accelerationism. Where I think Deleuze says Guattari thinks that the more Oedipal you are, the better it is, or something like that. And Deleuze
push it to the point of like breaking through the wall or whatever. However,
the schizophrenic wall or limit. But Deleuze is more interested in the rejection of what he refers to as Oedipal filth.
Critiquing that image of thought itself.
Exactly.
Yeah. That makes sense. And so it does make sense then how Hegel is the stand-in for Hippolyte, this series of substitutions, if we want to think in the Freudian sense, of the father figures. And it reminds me too of his break with another of his teachers, Alquier, who was kind of a scholar of Descartes and other thinkers of the Enlightenment. And I think it was in the dramatization of the idea, which is a paper he presented in a year before his dissertation in 1967. He's kind of asking these questions that he considers philosophical, which are very Nietzschean questions about who wants truth. We need to think about what it means to want the truth, right? What does it mean for?
Is this the method of dramatization?
I think that
he's giving
yeah. And Alquier is kind of like, this is disconcerting, and this is not necessarily a philosophical question, which I think it actually very much is, and that forms a whole. That forms one of the bedrocks of this critique of the image of thought, where we assume, like with Descartes, to think of another thinker, and I'll get back to this in a second, that Deleuze is critical of, but to think that you can forego certain presuppositions. You're not going to talk about man as a political animal or whatever. You're not going to start with these definitions, but you start with the cogito. You start with, I think, therefore I am. And Deleuze is like, well, you're just trading one set of presuppositions for another. You're foregoing defining animality or man, but you presume everyone knows what it means to think and to be, right? And I think that this is part of Deleuze's pushback against, we call it common sense, good sense, but also the goodwill or the natural light that supposedly all humans share in terms of thinking. And I guess that two things to get back to Hegel. One would be, I think that bringing up Descartes, I think Deleuze is very much, he doesn't center Descartes as much as Hegel, but he's very critical of Descartes in ways that are similar to Hegel. And two, I guess, would be sometimes my critique of the Deleuze-Hegel thing is maybe less concerned with misreadings, because Deleuze has already baked into the cake that he's going to have these productive misreadings, right? A bearded Hegel, a beardless Marx, right? A mustache Mona Lisa, which I think is, you know, you could say that that's whether that's fair or not, but that's part of his collage portraiture of the history of philosophy. My pushback to Deleuze is that sometimes he downplays Hegel's importance, and it makes me think that you're doing yourself a disservice by making your rival, your enemy, less powerful, right? It kind of Nietzsche is very good on this, where he's like, if you're disparaging your rival, your enemy, you ultimately disparage your victory over them, right? So you're kind of doing yourself a disservice in the more you
undermine the formidability.
Yeah, right. The more you caricature Hegel, and not that he only does that, but he can veer towards that. The less your overcoming of Hegel is monumental.
When he compliments him, it's sort of in this very backhanded, sort of way where he says he's
catty, a little bitchy.
Yeah, catty. Yeah, exactly. He's the most powerful homage to the traditional image of thought, or something along those lines. I think Malibu is so good on this issue, and also Jean Wall, who is another one of Deleuze's teachers, who he didn't have a break with, and who he continued to have mutual respect for one another. But I think what Malibu says is really true, that Hegel, you don't spend so much time critiquing something that doesn't have a powerful hold on your mind. If he thought that Hegel was just ridiculous, he would have just dismissed him, kind of the way he does with Wittgenstein. Now, that would be a
funny.
whole other.
The W is for Wittgenstein. That is a funny, what he calls him, like the assassin of philosophy.
The philosophical catastrophe.
that kind of shows what he thinks about analytic philosophy, just in a nutshell. But anyway, go on. Sorry.
That Deleuze is, that Hegel is his white whale. It's his heteron, the ultimate accursed one. It's the enemy of the thinker, the pack of the thinkers of difference, is what she says. Yes, Hegel is certainly open, susceptible to critique. And I think that he really privileged this one mode of dialectical thought. And he expressed it in a, profound and monumental and lasting way that created the precondition for all thinkers after him. I mean, was probably the most influential philosopher in the 18th century. I mean, maybe now Nietzsche is the most influential philosopher of the 18th century, but in the 18th century, it's sort of like there's just inevitably going to be a huge backlash against the most influential philosopher of an entire century. I forget where I was going with that. So
to jump in. And this has come to light more in my in our conversations with Dan Smith and reading his work, but it helped me to come to light, and it just came to me now thinking back, where part of perhaps what Deleuze is doing in Difference of Repetition is actually, he brings in Solomon Maimon to help critique Kant on the question of, it's not the conditions of possible experience, it's the genetic conditions of real experience. I wonder if this sustained dialogue with Kant that's going on in Difference of Repetition is this way of trying to, quote unquote, complete the system of German idealism in a way. If Kant is Hegel's daddy, Deleuze is going back and giving birth to this monstrous Kant, putting Kant on his feet, if you will, completing the system. Okay, I think transcendental empiricism is this gesture towards trying to go back and fix Kant or to set him right. And doing so, then you give birth to a totally different Hegel. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Metaphorically putting Kant on his feet so he can move, so he can walk, right?
Yeah.
So he can walk upright. But go ahead.
Walk around Königsberg.
Exactly.
Right,
Complete the circuit.
Completely. Schelling even says that, I think it was Schelling who says that Kant incipiently reintroduced the positive through the back door of the practical.
Interesting.
And I think Deleuze especially sees this opening from the, Kant's primarily negative critical philosophy in the third critique. What is it called again? The
critique of judgment, or you're
judgment,
talking about,
judgment.
And that's where the discord and accord of the faculties comes in, right?
With
Deleuze. Yeah. This gets back to the will to power, because I think that the way in which he formulates the will to power is in a Kantian phraseology, but with the Nietzschean twist. So it is kind of like this is why I think Nietzschean philosophy is the first instance of where Deleuze tries to set up Nietzsche and Hegel as the rivals. It's in his own work, Indifference to Repetition, where he takes this back up with Nietzsche to go back and impregnate Kant. He kind of changes the categorical imperative to the imperative of the will to power, which is whatever you will it to the nth power. Right. And I think that's kind of the Kantian impregnation, if you will, with Nietzsche thought, if you will. I think that's part of what's going on in order to continue this battle that he's fought. That he set up his beforehand, but in his own way, and to deepen it. Specifically, I think you pointed out dialectic of existence, but there's this other, he redefines dialectic and dialectics in logical sense and in different repetition. But I really like how he says the dialectic is a science of problems and the problematic. That's where I think, that's where I kind of find it, where he's interesting. And in the conclusion, he wants to push back against absolute knowledge as sort of the end goal and more towards cultivating learning, which is unconscious rather than this sort of project of consciousness. So I'm just bringing out some of these little threads and helping to set up more this rivalry, if you want to call it that, right? Deleuze does, I think in one text, I think in the Letter to a Harsh Critic, he talks about Kant and Hegel as the enemies. That's about as vicious as Deleuze will get.
I was just going back to something you were talking about with Nietzsche. I recently saw a prominent Nietzsche scholar, and I won't mention this person's name, I'm calling them out, but they were saying that Nietzsche just hated Hegel. That it was just an unequivocal hatred for Hegel. And I just think it's much more complex than that.
Yes, it is. Because
The Birth of Tragedy, he says, it's either in an attempt at self-criticism, which was, I think, 16 years after The Birth of Tragedy, or in Ecce Homo, which is just a few
right at the end,
few weeks or months before fully went
collapsed.
But he says it smells offensive. Oh no, it was in the letter. It was in the not the letter to her. It's in the attempt at self-criticism. He says it smells offensively Hegelian. But that's really interesting because it's this mythical dialectic, but it's literally the Hegelian dialectic expressed in mythical terms as the Apollonian and the Dionysian.
Right. I see that. I know what you're talking about now. He's reflecting on The Birth of Tragedy, right?
Right.
He's saying that about his own work, that it smells offensively Hegelian. So that kind of points to his influence, the fact that he was so influential throughout the 19th century, like you said.
And then later in Ecce Homo, he says that he calls his Birth of Tragedy, his first book, a remarkable book or something like that. And it's his first revaluation of all values. So he still found great value in it at the end of his trajectory.
Gotcha.
And, even Heidegger, I'm not a huge Heidegger person. I try to not give too much of my attention to a Nazi.
I respect that.
But you have to respect Heidegger. I mean, he's just obviously deeply influential and brilliant. But he says about Nietzsche that he constructs Nietzsche not as an enemy of Hegel or as an anti-Hegelian, but as a partially critical heir to Hegel.
Yes.
And I think that could be extended to Deleuze, because I think Deleuze talks about the already over man playing this refrain in different, it's the same melody, but in different words and a different instrument and different rhythm. And I think we can look at Deleuze as a differential repetition of the conceptual persona of Hegel, because Hegel was the dominant philosopher of his era who created the precondition for everyone to critique him, and I mean it became the sport of Hegel bashing in the 20th century. Everyone loves to hate Hegel, but he's still hugely influential and still widely read. And I think that in sort of another register, Deleuze, even more than Derrida, did fulfill that figure, I think, in the late 20th century and even in the first decade of the 21st century as sort of like the one figure that everyone was, this hysteria around Derrida, and it's the end of truth. And is he a post-truth conservative who paved the way for Trump, or is he a communist? It's none of those. Maybe all of them. No, he's definitely not a conservative. But
no,
that would be an interesting thing to talk about. But my point is that I think in the last 10 years or so, since Deleuze's citations have surpassed Derrida, and even Zizek in like 2003 said that Deleuze has become, which I think was a little early, he was jumping the gun a little on, but maybe among the cognoscenti or something, that Deleuze has become the central reference in continental philosophy. And I think that's very true now. And so now Deleuze is the one that we have to contend with. And so I think what we're seeing right now is it's been about a decade of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of texts being published about Deleuze, and deservedly so, because I think he's absolutely wonderful and brilliant. But now I think we're seeing that he's starting to become somewhat pervasive, and so maybe he's susceptible not only to critique but to extension and refinement into novel domains, rather than, I think there's a bit of a tendency among some Deleuzians, and I won't name any name, in relation to any great philosopher, to turn their work into an orthodoxy. Frida Beckmann says that in her biography of Deleuze. And it's kind of remarkable to do that with Deleuze, because he's so against orthodoxy. He's such a heterodox thinker who I think, intentionally eschewed having followers. I think he said that somewhere, that he doesn't want followers. He wants people to do their own work and to maybe be inspired by him, but to go off in their own directions.
He says something like that. It's just very Nietzschean, right? That he doesn't necessarily want people to write books on him or to even write books on his books, but to sort of use his books to do something else. And that's kind of how I see it too. And I suppose, Coop, I didn't know if I cut you off earlier, if you had something to jump in with.
I think I have maybe my last question.
Yeah,
please. Kind of more towards the wrap up. I don't know if we're quite there yet, but if we are, I could.
We can start to go there. It's almost been 2 hours. Grant answered a number of my questions ahead of time, which I appreciate, and I do like that. But yeah, I definitely want to hear.
I was more so just going to go to kind of what Grant, what you see as sort of your next step in terms of your work. If this is a project that you feel like you would continue working on, or if you have new horizons that you're going to pursue. Because I just wanted to mention briefly, I guess, a couple of thinkers that would be, I think, maybe sort of enriching this conceptual look at Deleuze and Hegel, and even Derrida as well, would be someone like Lyotard, who wrote the Differend. And Taylor, you might be able to speak to that a little bit, as far as if that's even a relevant conceptual foil for Derrida and Deleuze, etc. But I think that might be something interesting to look at. I know that we've discussed looking at that book on the podcast.
I'd like to read more of Lyotard. I read some of the Postmodern Condition years ago, and I thought it was really interesting, and I just haven't gotten back to him, but I'd really like to read more of his work.
I mean, Libidinal Economy is an incredible work. It's quite a read, so big fan of that.
Yeah,
and of course, sorry, go ahead.
No, I just I think the differend is what I like about Cooper's question is that the differend is part of the way I see it, is a good lens at what you try to do in differentiation and integration, which is precisely, the differend, if I can really boil it down or bastardize it, but it's finding this mode of dialogue between two parties who don't necessarily share the same mode of discourse, right? I mean, I know it's more complex than that, but that's kind of, I see some of that being worked out in your in the way in which you approach the thinkers in this book we were discussing.
That sounds especially resonant with the last chapter on Isabel Stengers,
Mm-hmm.
who I love, and I hope I can meet her at some point. I think she's in her mid-70s now.
Right.
Belgian philosopher. So Cooper, you were asking about,
Yeah,
ways
just
that I'm
kind of
thinking about going.
yeah. I guess the trajectory. I want to real quick just to throw this on top of this because I think it's relevant too. Is and again to browbeat Taylor with Stirner, but I think Stirner is actually someone interested. You know what I mean? If you're going to pursue, I guess, critiques of Hegel, I think that his is a very interesting one. That I don't know. It has some like at least partial resonances rather with Derrida, maybe just like a little bit, but I think overall it's kind of really more so this like sort of another post-Kant, it's attack on Kantian idealism ultimately.
Yeah, I'd like to read more Stirner. Yeah, he seems really interesting. So yeah, I mean, the directions I'm thinking about going now, the chapter on Stengers is shorter than I would have liked to be. I actually had to cut 5 chapters out of this book because
Interesting.
Yeah, it was initially quite a bit longer, and I cut a bunch of material from the other chapters as well. So the longest chapter is on the one on Deleuze, and then I think Hillman is the second longest, and then the ones on Jung and Whitehead and Stengers are all on the longer side. But Stengers is great, and I'm actually thinking I'd like to write a volume on her entire oeuvre. I think that would be a great thing to do. So I just came up with that idea about a week ago.
And particularly because she writes a book on Whitehead, right?
Yeah.
Which I believe that's been translated, right? I believe.
Yeah.
I haven't looked at it,
great.
but I was thinking your interest in Whitehead, that makes sense that Stengers would, but yeah, I guess before just to insert, before telling us about your next writing project, I would like to know a little bit about what you cut or the chapters you cut.
I had short chapters on Heraclitus, on Plato's Symposium.
Oh yeah, that's great text.
Just the speech from Euryximachus, I think.
Yeah, the medical doctor, right?
Yeah, where he talks about Heraclitus.
Gotcha. Okay.
I have a short chapter on Plotinus, not the whole Enneads, but just certain sections of the Enneads. On Nicholas of Cusa's On Learned Ignorance, which is
gotcha.
Great text. I actually say somewhere in this book that I think that Deleuze performs a similar role as a sort of mediator of a transition between epochs in the way that Nicholas of Cusa does between the medieval and the modern. He's sort of like right on the cusp in that Renaissance moment. And I think Deleuze is doing a similar thing, an opening to a novel epical construction. Oh, and then there was a long chapter on Jean Gebser, who I don't know if you guys are familiar with him.
No.
He had one magnum opus. It's The Ever-Present Origin. And he's read a lot by Jungians, sort of similar in a lot of ways to Whitehead. He's great. I mean, he's just not read very much in the academy. I'd like to turn that chapter into maybe like a short introduction at some point. I'd have to sort of flesh it out and expand it.
That sounds great.
Yeah, so I think like 50 or 60,000 words out of the original manuscript. Honestly, I think it made the book better. Like, for instance, Gebser isn't really part of this conversation in the way that all of these. So at the beginning of the last chapter, the concluding chapter with Isabel Stengers, I talk about how it's really 2 20th century streams of thought that I'm looking at. The one begins with Jamesian pragmatism, and then Bergson was really influenced by, but also influential on James. They wrote, Bergson wrote a preface for James, the translation of James's pragmatism, and
I didn't know that.
And James was actually going to write a preface to the English translation of Creative Evolution, but he died first before he could do it. So that would have been really interesting. And then Whitehead those were probably his 2 primary philosophical influences. So there's that sort of like Jamesian, Bergsonian, Whiteheadian, I think of it as constructivist stream of thought.
Yes.
And then there's the Jungian stream of thought, which is Jung and Hillman, which for me, it really comes together in Deleuze, because he was really influenced by Bergson, especially, but also by James and Whitehead, and also by Jung. And then I bring Stengers. Stengers is deeply, I think her 2 most prominent influences are probably Deleuze and Guattari and Whitehead. I see her as probably my favorite heir to those two streams of thought. And then the pre-20th century philosophers, they're the ones who they had really important conceptual contributions to the 20th century developments. So Spinoza, Leibniz, Hegel, Schelling, and Nietzsche.
That makes a lot of sense. And one of the things I respect about Stengers is, first of all, like having a sensitivity to science in a way that sometimes philosophy can mangle, right? Because a lot of times philosophy will want to try to ground science or try to give science a direction, or even like with Kant, try to make metaphysics the queen of the sciences or something in this other type of rivalry way. And so to have someone like Stengers, she reminds me a little bit, I know they have different topics, but in the mode of exposition and interrogation, she reminds me of Simondon, just to bring him back up for a second, because they both had this sensitivity and this practical knowledge of science, but yet to be able to sort of integrate the discourses of science and philosophy in a way that produces something new and isn't necessarily a philosophy of science in that sort of academic mode, if I may. It's a little bit, I don't even know if that's fair to philosophy of science, but you know what I'm saying. It has its own philosophical bearing.
You probably won't be very surprised to hear that she was really influenced by Simondon and writes about him quite a bit.
I got to read more Stengers then.
She's amazing.
She's got a lot of work on like chaos. She's got some work on chaos theory that sounds really interesting. That might be like probably like, building on chaosophy, I would imagine, if she sort of is in the trajectory of Deleuze and Guattari.
Yeah, Order Out of Chaos, super famous book. I've only just like flipped through it, so I have to admit my ignorance on Stengers. So that's something that
kind of stuff whets my little intellectual appetite. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Right. She got her start co-writing these texts with Ilya Prigogine, the Nobel Prize-winning scientist.
Oh, nice.
And so I think she wrote 2 texts with him, and then
Order Out of Chaos and New Alliance, right? Which is about philosophy and science, right? This new alliance between
I was thinking of The End of Certainty. I can't remember if the New Alliance is that one with Prigogine.
Yeah, that was one of their other books that I knew of that they did write together. It was just this notion of a new alliance among at least those 2 disciplines, if not building a further transdisciplinarity. To use a fun catchphrase that's now perhaps meaningless in the academy.
She's great. I've spent a lot of time reading her solo work, and also she has some really interesting co-written texts. I haven't read everything by her, but I've probably read about 90% of her books at this point. That's why I'm really looking forward to just going back through and rereading everything I've already read, and reading the things I haven't read. So I'm kind of
perhaps writing a book on it, right?
I think that would be a great thing to do, because I think she's a philosopher that should be more widely studied. And I think maybe part of the reason why she's not as widely studied, I think part of it probably has to do with just her gender, because she just doesn't fit the classical image of what a philosopher is.
Or a scientist, perhaps, too.
Yeah. But also, so cosmopolitics is really great. That's sort of that, and Thinking with Whitehead are her. It's 2 volumes of cosmopolitics, and then Thinking with Whitehead. They're probably her 2 magnum opuses, but cosmopolitics gets very deeply into science stuff, and some of it's, beyond my, beyond my understanding, but she is ultimately a philosopher. But I think, if anyone out there, any listeners out in Dreamland are looking to get into her work, I think one of her most recent books, Another Science is Possible, is a great place to start. And also Capitalist Sorcery with Philip Pignard is great. Yeah.
Okay.
So they're
like
like
the title.
shorter, really good books.
That's great, and you'll have to try to plan a trip over to Belgium to visit her. If you said you wanted to meet her at some point.
Yeah, so. I tried writing her, and I don't know if the email I found was the correct email, but
right.
You were talking earlier about how it's good I think that's a good thing to do, to write to people whose books you love, because people might be surprised.
Yeah,
that even well-known philosophers don't always get a lot of fan mail, so it can mean a lot. It can mean a lot to someone to hear some nice words about their book. Yeah,
I'm still trying to cajole Zizek into coming on, but he says he's too old to do the philosophical back and forth, and I think that's that's probably not true, but I'll keep trying. I'll keep reaching out to him.
Well, that would be amazing.
I'd
listen to it.
You could just turn on the recording device and let him go, and he's a one-man show, right? So,
right, yeah.
Obviously, your work, which just came out last month, right? I guess in June. Is that right?
Yeah, it came out on June 30th. So exactly.
It's already a month old. Get it any way you can, either through Amazon or through other means by which
subterranean means.
Subterranean means.
The Routledge site, if in case my publisher is listening.
Yeah, that's above board. Get it through Routledge, and it's. I think it's great. I still haven't read it all, so I still have more to read. I have to now go back and read the Stangers chapter. I really did like the way in which you mobilized these conceptual persona and had, kind of had a dialogue, or if you will, as my old professor used to say, a chorus of scholarly voices, right? You had this chorus of intellectual voices sort of interacting in the book. And, I think that your next project sounds good because it sounds like you've got stuff that you can recycle for another project, and more on Stingers would be great. I think that you're right, that perhaps there needs to be more literature on her and her name, given a little bit more discussion.
Thank you guys so much for having me on here, and for the greatest compliment a philosopher can get is just to have someone read your work and take it seriously and be interested in it. So I really appreciate you guys taking the time.
And to preempt Coop, since Coop, didn't you have a quip?
Oh yeah. Damn, we're really in sync if you were reading my mind there. Well, I just wanted to make a comment about, I think my favorite part of the book came in the acknowledgments. There was a bit of text and it read Cooper Cherry on there. Also Taylor Adkins. So
yes.
I got the alphabetical diff, I got the, since you did it in, I guess, how does one order the acknowledgments when you have, I'll take the alphabetical hierarchy there. So
for first and foremost, I want to thank Taylor Adkins.
Yes. Personally, I remember you reaching out. I didn't even know you were working on this project at the time, but when you reached out about the Simondon, it was nice because there was about a 6, 7, 8 month delay, specifically because of COVID, between sort of the finalized version and the publication. So I was able to get that to you ahead of time with, I believe there's minimal modifications. So it was nice that you were able to get something out of that, specifically the Jung connection. So the fact that you kind of sussed out something that I hadn't really thought about, right, which was this Jung connection between for Simondon and Deleuze. I thought that was nice that you were able to foreground that and highlight that. And so, like, it's interesting that it came back around to me, the dividends, right, of my translation through your work. That was nice. I got to see certain things. Sometimes you're too close to a text, so that was cool.
It was extremely helpful because I think that really helped me to think about certain issues in Deleuze and Guattari and in Stangers as well. So yeah, thanks for sharing that with me. And also I should mention that Mark Sabin, who's a professor at the University of Essex, who's one of the people who gave me a quote on the book, he told me, I don't know, I hope I'm not spilling the beans, but he told me that he's working on a book about Jung and Simondon.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
well, there you go. I mean,
in your translation.
I mean, that honestly, that's great. And we mentioned that text, as you said, that it bookends the second volume. It's the very last text, right, where he kind of brings up the alchemy stuff that he finds interesting in Jung. So that, to me, I would love to read a book on Jung and Simondon, because it honestly, when Simondon goes into the psychical, specifically with Freud, that was something that I got really attached to, like on the section on anxiety. But to bring out this other element of psychoanalysis through Jung is stuff that I don't know enough about, and that's always exciting to read about, So that's part of why I really appreciated your book, learning not just about some of the thinkers I love and feel like I know, but some of these other thinkers that I'll need to come back to, specifically like Stangers and Hillman, bringing that to the fore, and reading the chapter on James, who I also don't really know very well, seeing those voices integrated in this chorus of scholarly voices that I already enjoyed. That kind of opens up new horizons, or the ever receding horizon.
The ever receding horizon, elicited by the Dionysian chorus of skellies.
Well, Grant, we're going to let you go. We're going to stay on just to discuss some of the next schedulings, but this episode should be out in 2 weeks. We'll keep in touch with you and let you know when it drops, and really appreciate having you on. And
absolutely.
I loved our discussion today.
Me too. I had a great time, you guys. Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely.
Awesome.
Definitely getting a physical copy of the book, because my name's in it, so you can count on that.
Cooper, give me your address and I'll send you one.
Right on.
But it'll be through media mail, so it may or may not make it to you.
Right on.
No, it'll just we got all the time in the world to wait for that, and I do appreciate. I know Cooper. We were joking about it, but we appreciate
total respect. Yeah, no doubt.
We appreciated. I appreciate the acknowledgement, and I'm just so glad we had you on today. So thanks again for that.
Thanks, guys.
Once again, thanks to Grant Maxwell for joining us on this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins.
The very rules of healing, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is focus to the whole state of things, the pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here. What I meant is the following.
With nothing left but recycled, whitewashed, lobotomized people, as in Clockwork Orange.